So I want to move on then in our discussion to the next chapter in my book, Dead Celebrities and Living Icons, to a discussion of Walt Disney. And Walt Disney, like Howard Hughes, belongs to the world of the pre-epoch of the coming of the later celebrities that are typified by James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, Elvis Presley, John F. Kennedy in the 50s and 60s. This is the pre-epoch of the great sculptors, the architects of the proscenium. In the previous discussion we saw how Howard Hughes created the global stage, the global proscenium, upon which the drama of the dying and reviving mythic celebrity would be enacted. So he's he works with space, sculpting and arranging space in that way, sending ships and airplanes and satellites around the globe. But with Walt Disney, what we'll see, he's a co-creator of this world, but what he creates, he sculpts blocks of time, not space. He moves historical epochs he divorces them from their context in history and sets them beside one another, like the articles in a newspaper. As McLuhan said, the newspaper in the 19th century was the first symbolist art masterpiece, because there you had a series of articles, none of which were connected to any of the others. And so all the connections between them are removed. And it's like in jazz, where you have syncopated notes. You pull out the connecting notes and you get syncopation in jazz. Same thing with symbolist poetry. And all of this is part of the what McLuhan thought of as the electric landscape. The landscape configured by electricity, in which you get everything all at once, and linear time that unfolds in a linear fashion with past, present, future, which had been part of the Gutenbergian three-dimensional world of perspectival space, began to be melted down with the rise of electromagnetic technology in the 19th century. And as time began to be melted down, it was no longer linear, and we began to have this idea of disconnected epochs of time, also disconnected spaces, like in non-Euclidean geometry, where we have all these curved spaces, warped spaces, and in Einstein's cosmos, each object creates its own frame of reference as it moves relative to other objects. It's in the same electrotopia. Clocks on the ground move slower than clocks that are further away from gravitational wells. The temporalities are different. And likewise with objects, when they attain light speed, they collapse in the direction of their motion, and they elongate and distort, and they also carve out their own temporal frames of reference as they approach light speed. And light in that cosmos does not travel as it does in the Newtonian cosmos in rectilinear fashion. It moves along geodesics of curved space. It moves through spaces that are curved by massive objects such as planets and stars, which bend and warp the space around them, so that light curves around those curved spaces. And so this is the electrotopic world now that is coming in. The first work in literature that configures this is Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, which was one of Walt Disney's favorite books and remained basically the prototype for all of his projects. In one way or another, Alice in Wonderland provided him with the blueprint for all of his projects. This novel came out in 1865, the same year, by the way, I believe it's the same year, 65 or 66, as Manet's painting Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, in which he has the famous Luncheon on the Grass painting, where he has the naked woman dining with the two clothed men on the grass. And in the background, there's a woman who, if she were perspectively correct, would be a 9-foot-tall giant. And so that's one of the first paintings to begin to dissolve perspective and to begin to separate spaces out from one another, so that each one carves out its own spatio-temporal niche. And then we see in Cezanne, where he eliminates all the depth perspective, the idea of objects contained in a single depth perspectival space created from the point of view of an individual subject. We get multiple objects, each existing in its own space, apples and bowls on tables and so forth. So this is the electrotopic world. And in Alice in Wonderland, we begin to see, as Alice goes down the rabbit hole and she moves into this wonderlandscape, she's really moving into electrotopia. It's the Einsteinian cosmos of bent and curved and warped shapes. She undergoes spatial distortions. She grows up to the size of a giant, shrinks down to the size of an ant, and she undergoes all these wonderful spatial distortions. So she's the first character in literature to be put inside of non-Euclidean space, electric space, basically. And it's interesting because each of the chapters in those two novels, Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, are basically discontinuous. They don't really unfold a linear story. That each chapter tells a self-contained series of episodes and anecdotes. The chapter on the Mad Tea Party, for example, has no relationship whatsoever to the chapters that precede it or that follow it. The chapter in which the Mad Hatter is incarcerated, he's actually incarcerated before he's tried, so the cause and effect is reversed there. So each of these chapters is like a separate island that don't add up to much of a linear narrative. And so, and just then as this Wonderland world becomes basically the world that Walt Disney will build as Disneyland. It's Disneyland is the transformation of Alice's Wonderland into three-dimensional space. And indeed, Disney was one of the co-creators of the cartoon, the animated cartoon character. And one of the first masks, one of the first avatars, were his Laugh-O-Gram shorts, in which he appears as the character of Alice, who moves through this landscape in the teens, the 19-teens. And along with Winsor McKay and Otto Messmer, these are the first men to begin taking the comic strip from the newspaper and plugging it in and turning it on, sending electric current racing through it, and then we get the cartoon. The comic strip had evolved out of the political cartoon in the newspapers at the end of the 19th century. You got the Yellow Kid and so forth. And so these men simply plugged them in and sent electricity racing through them to give us the animated short. So all along, what Disney is doing here is creating the electric cosmos. He's configuring it and creating it and moving us into the world which we're still in today, the American theme park world, which is divorced from history, and everything is a sort of aperspectival, postmodern collage and melange of styles ripped from historical epochs and set right beside each other in three-dimensional space. And that's basically what you get in Alice in Wonderland. It's the prefiguration of this world. And so Disney begins in the teens with these cartoons, and he comes up with a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Disney was born, by the way, in 1901 and dies in 1966. So those are his vectors, birth and death. And but in the 1920s, there was a crisis with the studio of animators that he was working with. They defected from him and went to a rival studio, and he lost the rights to this character, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and he was very depressed and upset by this. And from out of this, he came up with the character of Mickey Mouse. And so this is basically analogous to what you get in Through the Looking Glass, when Alice is standing in front of the looking glass, and she has her white kitten and her black kitten, and they appear in the looking glass as the Red Queen and the White Queen. They've been transfigured into their mythic iconotypes. Walt Disney, likewise, looking at himself in front of the looking glass, sees Mickey Mouse staring back at him. So Mickey Mouse is his avatar. This is his two-dimensional avatar that appears in the world of electrotopic media. That's him, and he provided the voice for Mickey Mouse in the first cartoons. And so the first Mickey Mouse cartoon is 1928. It's called Plane Crazy. And the idea of a mouse appearing to him may not be accidental either. There's a certain symbolism there because mice in ancient mythology always appear as characters which have powers that are out of all proportion to their size. The mice intimidates the elephant, for example, a mighty creature. In Aesop's fables, it helps the lion get out of a snare. And there are legends that it carved a hole in Noah's Ark and ate its way through it, created a hole in a dam in a Dutch dike that caused water to come out. So it has these enormous powers that are out of proportion to its size. And so this may have come to Disney as a kind of aid in one of the darkest periods of his life, and he created then these cartoons. They were an amazing success. And we have to remember that this is 1928, just before the Great Depression hit. And if you look at the early Mickey Mouse black and white cartoons, what you see there basically is a mouse character that is constantly in a situation where he's losing control. He is constantly under threat of losing control of a train, or he's in a haunted house, or whatever the environment happens to be to which he is subject, and he is beset, and he can barely control the circumstances. Usually he's completely out of control and at the mercy of the environment. And I think that part of the popularity of Mickey Mouse was that the average person identified with him in the Great Depression as being a victim of the great forces in the environmental and financial and business world that beset upon him, and he had lost control over his environment. And this is also significant of the fact that Disney at this time felt that he was on the verge of losing his studio, and he wasn't sure if it was going to work. But fortunately it did, and the Mickey Mouse phenomenon caught on. And through the late 20s and 30s, Disney achieved his fame with this Mickey Mouse character. So that's his first avatar. Alice first in the Laugh-O-Gram shorts of the teens and 20s, and then Mickey Mouse in the late 20s and 30s. Then along about 1937, we have him creating the first great full-length celluloid cartoon, animated cartoon, as a full-length feature movie with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And that film is, I think, still his best film. None of the others really compare very well to it. It's a finely crafted work of pop art. And the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is, in Grimm, it's the story of how a young woman, encountering these seven dwarfs, who are not named in the original Grimm story, is transformed into a sexually receptive and mature female ready to bear progeny, which the dwarves symbolize, more or less. But in Disney's narrative, he gives them names, and we have to remember that in ancient mythology, dwarves are connected with metallurgy. They work down in the earth, in the bowels of the earth, in mines. And so they're always, the metallurgist is thought of, according to Mircea Eliade in his book, The Forge and the Crucible, the metallurgist is thought of as an obstetrician who takes the embryo of the ore and gradually transmutes it into the gold through the alchemical process of transmutation. So I think we have to keep that in mind, that the dwarves had this ancient symbolism, and that with Snow White we're really dealing with Disney's muse now, not his avatar. And so this is about the relationship to his muse, who is inspiring him now with a brand new Technicolor world of animated movies. And she is being transformed and alchemically transmuted in this process by these seven dwarves. And we recall that the metals in ancient tradition, each one of the metals was associated with one of the seven heavenly bodies. The moon with silver, the sun with gold, Jupiter with tin, Venus with copper, Mars with iron, Saturn with lead, and so on. And the cosmology of the soul descending down through each one of those spheres on its way to be born on the earth was the ancient Greek idea, the ancient Greek conception of birth. And that as it descended through each one of these spheres, it picked up one of the archetypal qualities of that sphere, such as from Venus it picked up its capacity to love. From Mars it picked up its proud, aggressive, warlike capacity. From the sun it picked up the ego, basically. From Jupiter its pride and its regality. From Saturn the propensity toward melancholy and depression, and so forth. And so these archetypal qualities of these seven heavenly spheres were imprinted on the soul at birth. And so with Snow White and her contact with these dwarves, what we're really getting here is the construction of the soul of Disney's muse as it's being constructed, and the dwarves become analogous to the animators in his studio who are bringing Snow White to life for him in vivid Technicolor through the application of their arts and skills. So he's working out a new relationship with his muse in this film, and that's what we're seeing on screen there. And it's a kind of a pop art masterpiece. He follows this a year or two later with Pinocchio, which is another great film, in which he moves from the world of the Gothic Germanic north of Grimm's fairy tales to the southern Mediterranean with Collodi's novel Pinocchio, in the world of Italian puppet plays and harlequins and the Commedia dell'arte and so forth of the Mediterranean. It's a brighter, sunnier world with a different kind of mythological disposition. Collodi's novel, though, is very different. If you read it, it's very different from Disney's film. He removes all the negative elements. In the novel we find Pinocchio, when Geppetto first encounters him, as an uncarved block of wood that hurls insults and abuse at him. And then when he carves it, the creature leaves and runs off, and turns Geppetto over to the authorities on suspicion of child abuse. And he goes off, and one of his adventures, he wakes up to find his feet burned off because he rested them on a brazier. And when he encounters the cricket that becomes Jiminy Cricket in the film, he hurls him against a wall and smashes him when the cricket insults him. And then he's later cheated by the fox and the fox and the cat, I think it is, and they hang him from the gallows. And so we get all this wonderful imagery that is appropriate for an Italian puppet play, as it were, but it's not appropriate for the mass audience of children that Disney is directing these films towards. So he eliminates those elements, and he changes the myth of Pinocchio so that it comes closer to the myth of Pygmalion and Galatea, in which Pygmalion creates the beautiful Galatea, carves her, the statue, out of a block of marble, and then he prays to the goddess Venus to bring her to life, exactly as Geppetto, before he goes to bed, prays to whoever, the muses, whoever it is. And the Blue Fairy shows up to animate Pinocchio and turn him into a real boy, just as on the Sistine Chapel we see Adam animated by the touch of God who gives him the spark of life. And that spark of life is, of course, the current of electricity that is now animating the film of Pinocchio and giving life via electricity to the animated comics of Disney's early films. So these early films are great. They're quite wonderful. Fantasia, in particular, is another great, wonderful film. But now Pinocchio and Fantasia did not do well at the box office, and then it was followed by Bambi, which was a complete flop. And so in the 1940s, this put his studio in dire financial circumstances. And it was basically conscripted by the U.S. government during the war years to make educational and technical films for the military. And it was a very degrading thing for him to do.